Diane Hale lifted her wine glass and smiled at Susie Watkins like she was speaking to charity instead of family. "Let's be honest," she said loudly enough for the entire dining room to hear. "Without Grayson, you wouldn't last 6 months in the real world." A few guests laughed nervously. Susie felt every eye at the table slide toward her. Her husband didn't defend her. Grayson only leaned back in his chair, swirling bourbon like this humiliation bored him. Then his phone lit up beside his plate. A message from Vanessa. "Miss you already." Susie looked at that screen and smiled. Because what nobody at that table knew was that she had spent the last 2 years preparing to destroy the illusion they built around him. And tonight, she was finally done pretending to be powerless. If you've ever stayed quiet while people underestimated you, comment below how long you would have waited before walking away, and stay with me until the end, because Susie's revenge wasn't loud, it was devastating. The first time Susie Watkins met Grayson Hale, he looked at her like she was the only intelligent person in the room. That was what she remembered most. Not the expensive rooftop bar in downtown Chicago, not the skyline glowing behind him, not even the way every woman at the networking event kept staring at him. It was the way he listened. Back then, Susie was 28, sharp-minded, ambitious, and halfway through building a reputation at one of the most competitive financial consulting firms in Illinois. She worked brutal hours, survived on coffee and spreadsheets, and secretly loved every second of it. Grayson had walked up beside her during a conversation about investment restructuring and casually corrected a senior executive's projection model without sounding arrogant. Susie had laughed. "You know most people hate men like you, right?" she'd teased. He grinned. "Only the insecure ones." She should have recognized the warning hidden inside that sentence, but she didn't. Because Grayson Hale was magnetic in the beginning. He sent flowers to her office, memorized her coffee order, stayed up late helping her prepare presentations, told everyone she was brilliant, told everyone she intimidated him, and for a while, Susie believed she had found a man who genuinely admired strong women. Then they got married, and little by little, admiration turned into convenience. The Hale family lived in one of the wealthiest suburbs in Connecticut, where every house looked like it belonged in an architecture magazine, and every marriage looked happier from the outside than it actually was. Their home sat behind iron gates and perfectly trimmed hedges, white stone exterior, massive windows, a kitchen bigger than Susie's first apartment. People envied her life constantly. "You're so lucky," women at charity events would whisper. "Grayson is obsessed with you. You two are couple goals." Susie learned how to smile on command. The truth was harder to explain, because nothing toxic happened all at once. It happened slowly, quietly, like water rising around someone who didn't realize she was drowning. At first it was compromise. Grayson's startup opportunity required relocating to Connecticut. "My career finally has momentum," he told her one night, while unpacking takeout containers in their tiny Chicago apartment. "I just need a few years of focus. Then we'll prioritize yours too." Susie loved him, so she said yes. Then came the sacrifices. She turned down a promotion because Grayson needed her support during fundraising season. She stopped traveling for work because his schedule was too stressful. She handled dinners, holidays, social obligations, and eventually even his bookkeeping during the company's unstable early years. Every time she gave something up, Grayson kissed her forehead and promised it was temporary. "You're my partner," he'd say. "I couldn't do any of this without you." But over time, gratitude disappeared. Expectation replaced it. Especially after Diane Hale inserted herself into every corner of their marriage. Diane was the kind of woman who weaponized politeness. Everything sounded graceful until you realized it was cruel. At family dinners, she would glance at Susie's outfit and smile faintly. "Oh, you're brave enough to wear cream after Labor Day. Or Grayson always dated women with stronger personalities before marriage? I suppose people change. Sometimes she didn't even bother hiding it, especially after Susie struggled with fertility treatments. That was when Diane became vicious. Well, she sighed dramatically one Christmas Eve while carving roast beef. Some women are meant for careers. Others are meant for motherhood. The room had gone silent. Susie remembered gripping her wine glass so tightly her fingers hurt. Grayson didn't defend her. He never defended her. Later that night, when she cried in their bathroom, he wrapped his arms around her with exhausted irritation instead of comfort. "You know how my mom is," he muttered. "Why do you always take things so personally? That sentence became the foundation of their marriage. Why are you upset? Why are you sensitive? Why can't you let things go?" Eventually, Susie stopped expressing hurt altogether. It was easier that way, safer. Years passed inside routines that slowly erased her identity. Grayson's company expanded. Their wealth exploded. Their social circle became filled with investors, executives, charity board members, and women who spoke in curated Instagram captions. Meanwhile, Susie became invisible. Not publicly. Publicly, she was the perfect wife. Elegant, supportive, beautiful beside him in photographs. Privately, she ate dinners alone while Grayson worked late. Or claimed to. The emotional distance between them became impossible to ignore. He stopped touching her casually, stopped asking about her day, stopped looking at her during conversations. Sometimes Susie would speak and realize halfway through that he wasn't listening at all. One night, she found herself sitting alone in their enormous kitchen at nearly midnight while rain battered the windows outside. Grayson finally walked through the front door without apologizing. His coat smelled expensive, not like whiskey, not like work. Something floral, something feminine. "You're still awake?" he asked distractedly. Susie looked up from the untouched cup of tea in front of her. "You said you'd be home at 8. Meeting ran late. No eye contact, no warmth, just annoyance. He loosened his tie while scrolling through his phone, then immediately headed upstairs. "I'm gonna shower." Susie sat motionless for several seconds after he disappeared. Something felt wrong. Not suddenly wrong. Not dramatic, just off, like a tiny crack finally becoming visible after years beneath the surface. She stood slowly and noticed Grayson's coat tossed carelessly across the dining chair. A white receipt peeked from the pocket. Normally, Susie would have ignored it. Normally, she would have respected privacy. Normally, she would have convinced herself she was imagining things. But tonight, something inside her hesitated, then reached. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper. The receipt was from the Beaumont Hotel in Manhattan. A luxury hotel, champagne service, presidential suite, 2 guests. Susie frowned immediately, because 3 weeks earlier she specifically remembered asking Grayson if he'd ever stayed there after hearing investors discuss it at a gala. He'd laughed casually. No, overpriced nonsense. But the date on the receipt was from last weekend. The weekend he claimed he was in Boston for business. Susie stared at the paper so long her vision blurred. Her heartbeat slowed instead of racing. That scared her more than panic would have, because deep down, she already knew. Footsteps echoed upstairs, Grayson humming softly in the shower. Completely comfortable, completely certain she would never question him. Susie folded the receipt carefully, then slipped it back exactly where she found it. When she finally looked toward the staircase, her expression had changed. Not broken, not hysterical, just quietly devastated, quietly awakening. And for the first time in years, one terrifying thought entered her mind. What if everyone was right? What if she really had built her entire life around a man who no longer loved her, Susie stared into the dark reflection of the kitchen windows and whispered the question she wasn't ready to hear answered. Who were you there with? Susie Watkins didn't confront Grayson about the hotel receipt. That surprised even her. 5 years earlier, she would have cried immediately, asked questions, searched his face desperately for reassurance. She would have accepted any explanation he offered because losing him felt more terrifying than doubting herself. But something had changed, not healed, not stronger, just exhausted. Emotionally exhausted people stop screaming eventually. They go quiet instead. The morning after she'd found the receipt, Susie stood in their marble kitchen making coffee while Grayson scrolled through emails across the island counter. He looked expensive even at 7 in the morning. Tailored navy suit, Rolex, sharp jawline, calm confidence. The kind of man people trusted instantly. The kind of man women warned each other about after divorces. You okay? He asked without looking up from his phone. Susie glanced at him carefully. You got home late. Big client issues. Instant answer. Smooth. Practiced. No hesitation. That bothered her most. Not the possibility that he was lying, the possibility that he had become good at it. She slid his coffee across the counter. Did Boston go well last weekend? Still typing. No eye contact. Susie watched him for several seconds. You never told me where you stayed. Now he looked up. Only briefly. The Fairmont, I think. Lie. So effortless. So casual. The realization moved through her chest like cold water. Not because she caught him, because he assumed she'd never notice. Grayson stepped around the counter and kissed her forehead absently. I'll be late tonight, too. Then he left. The front door shut quietly behind him, and Susie stood frozen in the massive, silent kitchen staring at the spot where he'd just been. The strange thing about betrayal wasn't the moment you discovered it. It was the horrifying realization that your instincts had probably known long before your mind admitted it. Over the next few weeks, Susie began noticing everything. Tiny details she'd ignored before suddenly became impossible to unsee. Grayson started carrying his phone everywhere, even to the bathroom. He changed his password after years of keeping the same one. He started going to the gym obsessively despite barely having time to sleep. There was a new sharpness in the way he dressed. New cologne, more business trips, more irritation whenever Susie asked simple questions. One night, while adjusting his tie before a charity gala in Manhattan, he stared at his reflection and casually asked, You wearing that? Susie looked down at the dark emerald dress she'd spent an hour choosing. What's wrong with it? Nothing. He shrugged. It's just a little conservative. The word landed harder than it should have. Conservative. Not beautiful, not elegant, not stunning. Just safe. Like her. At the gala, Susie felt invisible beside him. The ballroom glittered with old money and designer gowns. Crystal chandeliers reflected across champagne towers, while a string quartet played near the staircase. Women touched Grayson's arm constantly while laughing too hard at his jokes. Men admired him. Investors respected him, and Susie suddenly felt like decorative furniture standing beside a life she helped build, but no longer belonged inside. Then Diane arrived. Grayson Hale could insult someone while smiling warmly enough to avoid consequences. She air-kissed Susie's cheek. You look tired, sweetheart. I'm fine. Diane tilted her head sympathetically. You know men pull away when women stop trying. Susie blinked slowly. I'm sorry. Oh, don't be sensitive. Diane sipped champagne. I'm only saying marriage requires maintenance. Especially when powerful men have options. There it was. The warning hidden inside fake concern. Susie looked across the ballroom instinctively. Grayson stood near the investor's table, laughing at something a blonde woman whispered into his ear. Tall, elegant, white silk gown, beautiful in the polished, intimidating way magazine covers were beautiful. The woman touched Grayson's wrist lightly. Too familiar, too comfortable. Something twisted painfully inside Susie's stomach. "Who is that?" she asked quietly. Diane followed her gaze. "Oh, Vanessa Cole." Her lips curved faintly. "She's one of the executives at Grayson's firm. Brilliant woman." Then she added deliberately, "Very ambitious." Susie kept staring. Vanessa leaned closer toward Grayson, and Grayson smiled in a way Susie hadn't seen in years. Not polite, not distracted, alive. Hours later, snow drifted softly outside the Manhattan Hotel hosting the gala. Guests filtered toward black SUVs and waiting drivers while music faded behind the ballroom doors. Susie stood near the coat check searching for Grayson when she noticed him walking quickly toward the side exit. Alone, or so she thought. Something instinctive told her to follow him. She didn't fully understand why. Maybe because women always know, even before proof. Outside, icy wind sliced through her coat as she stepped onto the sidewalk. The city glowed silver beneath falling snow. Grayson crossed the street without noticing her, then stopped beneath the awning of a luxury apartment building. Seconds later, Vanessa appeared. Ivory coat, gold heels, perfect blonde hair catching snowflakes beneath the streetlights. Susie froze completely. Vanessa smiled up at Grayson like she already belonged to him. Then he kissed her. Not casually, not drunkenly, not like a mistake. Like a man kissing someone he'd wanted all night. The world around Susie went strangely silent. No traffic, no voices, no music. Just that kiss. Sharp enough to split her life cleanly in half. Before. After. Her body reacted first. Numb fingers, shallow breathing, a violent pressure in her chest. But the tears never came. That frightened her. Because heartbreak should have shattered her. Instead, she felt something colder. "A terrible kind of clarity." Vanessa laughed softly against Grayson's mouth before saying something Susie couldn't hear. Grayson brushed snow from Vanessa's hair gently, tenderly, the way he used to touch Susie. The realization hit harder than the cheating itself. He still had softness inside him. He had simply stopped giving it to his wife. Susie stepped backward, instinctively hiding behind a parked SUV before they could see her. Her hands trembled violently as she pulled out her phone. For one brief second, guilt stopped her. Then she remembered every lonely dinner, every cruel comment from Diane, every night Grayson made her feel irrational for noticing distance. Every moment she blamed herself for his absence. Click. The camera captured them perfectly beneath the falling snow. Grayson's hand around Vanessa's waist. Vanessa smiling up at him, intimate, certain, real. Susie stared at the photo afterward until her vision blurred. This was no longer suspicion, no longer insecurity, no longer imagination. It was betrayal. Documented, undeniable, and somehow that almost felt relieving. Because now she could finally stop gaslighting herself. Across the street, Grayson kissed Vanessa one more time before disappearing inside the building with her. Together, without hesitation, without guilt. Susie remained motionless on the sidewalk long after they vanished. Snow gathered silently across her dark coat. People passed around her without noticing the woman whose marriage had just quietly collapsed in the middle of Manhattan. Finally, she looked down at the photograph again, then whispered the words that changed everything. "You lied to me." But deep down, the truly devastating part was this. He had lied so many times before that she no longer knew which version of her marriage had ever been real. For 3 days after seeing Grayson kiss Vanessa, Susie Watkins moved through life like a ghost, wearing expensive clothes. She still attended meetings, still answered emails, still smiled at neighbors in their pristine Connecticut suburb. But internally, something fundamental had cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like a foundation giving way beneath a house that looked perfect from the outside. The strangest part was Grayson himself. He acted completely normal, maybe even happier. At breakfast, he discussed stock projections while scrolling through market reports. At dinner, he complained about investors. At night, he climbed into bed beside her, smelling faintly of unfamiliar perfume, and slept peacefully. Peacefully. That word made Susie physically ill, because she hadn't slept properly in weeks. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw them beneath the falling snow. His hand on Vanessa's waist. That smile, that softness, it replayed in endless loops inside her mind. And worse than the cheating itself was the humiliation. Everyone probably knew before she did. The assistants at his office, the investors, maybe even Diane. Especially Diane. By the 4th night, Susie found herself standing alone in their bathroom at 2 a.m, staring at her reflection under soft vanity lights. She looked beautiful. That was the cruel irony. Her dark hair fell perfectly over one shoulder. Her skin still glowed. Her figure remained elegant and slim despite years of stress. People constantly complimented her appearance, yet somehow she still felt fundamentally unwanted. Susie gripped the marble sink harder. "What's wrong with me?" she whispered. The question escaped before she could stop it. And suddenly, memories began surfacing all at once. Grayson canceling anniversaries because of work. Grayson checking his phone during conversations. Grayson sighing whenever she became emotional. Grayson slowly treating her like a responsibility instead of a wife. Then came the most painful memory of all. 2 years earlier, after another failed fertility treatment. Susie had sat crying quietly in their bedroom while rain tapped against the windows. "I'm sorry," she'd whispered brokenly. Grayson looked exhausted. Not heartbroken, just inconvenienced. "You act like this is only happening to you," he snapped. The words had cut deeper than he realized. Because even then, Susie apologized afterward. She always apologized afterward for crying, for needing reassurance, for wanting affection, for existing too emotionally inside a marriage that demanded silence from her. Now staring at herself in the mirror years later, she felt sudden overwhelming rage toward the woman she used to be. Not because she was weak, because she kept begging for love from people who enjoyed withholding it. Downstairs, she heard the front door open. Grayson was home. Again, late. Again, careless. Susie wiped her face quickly and forced herself calm before walking downstairs. Grayson stood in the foyer, loosening his tie while texting someone, smiling. The sight made her chest ache instantly. "You're home late," she said carefully. He didn't even look up. "Big client dinner." Lie. Susie already knew the signs now. The relaxed expression, the slight distraction, the emotional absence. He was somewhere else mentally. Somewhere with her. Grayson finally glanced up. "You okay?" That question almost made Susie laugh. No, actually. She wasn't okay. Her marriage was collapsing in slow motion while her husband gaslit her professionally, but instead she nodded. "I'm fine." He moved toward the kitchen. "Good. I've got an early morning tomorrow." That was it. No curiosity, no concern, no noticing that the woman beside him was emotionally drowning. Later that night, Susie sat alone in bed while Grayson showered in the adjoining bathroom. Steam drifted beneath the door. His phone buzzed on the nightstand beside her. Normally, he kept it glued to his hand. Tonight, he forgot it. The screen lit up again. Vanessa. Susie stared at the name until nausea twisted through her stomach. She knew she shouldn't look. She also knew the truth already existed, whether she opened the messages or not. Slowly, she picked up that phone. The passcode had changed. Of course it had. But a preview notification still glowed across the screen. Last night was worth every lie. Susie stopped breathing. Then another message appeared. She still suspects nothing. A long silence filled the bedroom, the kind of silence that changes people permanently. Something cold moved through Susie's body. Not heartbreak anymore, humiliation. They were laughing at her, together. The bathroom door suddenly opened. Susie placed the phone back instantly. Grayson stepped out in gray sweatpants, towel around his neck. For one dangerous second, she almost confronted him, almost screamed, almost threw the phone at his face and demanded the truth. But then she saw his expression, relaxed, confident, certain of his control, and Susie understood something important. If she confronted him now, he would manipulate the situation immediately. He would deny everything. Call her paranoid, sensitive, emotionally unstable. Then Diane would get involved. Then somehow Susie would become the problem. Again. No. She suddenly realized emotional reactions were exactly what people like Grayson relied on. Chaos protected men like him. Preparation destroyed them. That night, Susie waited until Grayson fell asleep before quietly leaving the bedroom. She walked downstairs barefoot through the dark, silent house and sat alone in the kitchen. Moonlight reflected across marble counters. The luxury home felt colder than ever. Her hands trembled as she opened her laptop. For several minutes, she simply stared at the screen, then slowly typed a name she hadn't spoken in years. Natalie Brooks, Harvard law graduate, elite divorce attorney in Boston, and once upon a time, Susie's closest friend. Back in college, Natalie used to joke that Susie saw the best in people while she prepared for the worst. "You're too forgiving," Natalie warned her constantly, "and you're emotionally unavailable," Susie used to tease back. Funny how life changed people. Susie found Natalie's law firm website quickly. Brooks and Avery, family law, specializing in high net worth divorces, asset protection, corporate marital disputes. The site alone made Susie's pulse spike. Divorce. Even thinking the word felt unreal. She stared at the contact form for almost 10 minutes. Then another memory surfaced unexpectedly. 6 months earlier. Grayson standing in the kitchen during a work call laughing carelessly. "She'd fall apart without me." At the time, Susie pretended not to hear it. Tonight, the memory landed differently, not painful, insulting. A slow anger finally began replacing grief. Susie opened a blank email. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, then typed, "Hi, Natalie. I think my husband is cheating on me and I need help." She nearly deleted it immediately. Instead, she hit send. The email disappeared. And with it something inside, Susie shifted permanently. Not healed, not stronger yet, but awake. The next afternoon, Susie drove alone into Boston under heavy gray skies. Her stomach twisted harder with every mile. Part of her still felt ridiculous for being there. Maybe she misunderstood everything. Maybe Grayson would explain. Maybe this could still be fixed. But deep down, another quieter voice had started whispering the truth. Healthy love does not make someone feel this alone. Natalie's office occupied the top floor of a sleek glass building overlooking the harbor. Modern, sharp, controlled, just like Natalie herself. When Susie stepped inside the office, Natalie immediately stood from behind her desk. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Natalie crossed the room and hugged her tightly. And somehow, that nearly broke Susie more than the affair itself, because it had been years since someone held her gently without asking for anything in return. Natalie pulled back slowly. "You look exhausted," she said softly. Susie laughed weakly. "That obvious to me, yes?" They sat near the massive windows overlooking the city. Susie explained everything: the hotel receipt, Vanessa, the messages, the lies. Natalie listened without interruption. No judgment, no fake optimism, just careful attention. Finally, Natalie leaned back quietly. "Susie," she said carefully, "I need you to understand something." Susie nodded nervously. If Grayson is hiding an affair, there's a good chance he's hiding money too. The room suddenly felt colder. What Natalie's expression hardened. Men like your husband rarely betray in only one direction. Susie stared at her silently. Natalie folded her hands calmly across the table. "If you want freedom," she said, "stop acting like a devastated wife and start thinking like a strategist." A long silence passed between them. Then Susie asked the question that changed the course of her entire life. How Natalie's eyes sharpened. First, she said quietly, "You stop letting them underestimate you." The first thing Natalie Brooks taught Susie Watkins was this: emotion is expensive in divorce. They sat inside Natalie's Boston office while cold rain streaked the windows behind them. Legal files covered the conference table between them, organized into neat stacks that somehow made Susie's entire marriage feel clinical, transactional, reducible. Natalie slid a yellow legal pad toward her. "From now on," she said calmly, "you document everything." Susie stared down at the empty page. Everything. Natalie nodded. Every suspicious transaction, every overnight trip, every lie, every asset, every conversation that matters. Then she leaned forward slightly, and Susie stopped reacting emotionally in front of him. That part was harder, much harder, because Grayson still came home smelling like another woman, still lied effortlessly over breakfast, still kissed her forehead sometimes like muscle memory while betraying her behind closed doors. And every single time Susie had to force herself not to scream. The strange thing was, Grayson seemed happier the more disconnected she became. When Susie stopped asking questions, he relaxed. When she stopped confronting him, he became careless. And that was exactly what Natalie wanted. People reveal themselves fully once they think they've won, Natalie explained during one of their weekly meetings, so Susie let them think she was weak. For 2 years. 2 entire years. At first, survival felt impossible. There were nights Susie locked herself in the guest bathroom just to cry silently where Grayson couldn't hear her. Nights she stared at the ceiling, wondering how someone who once loved her could become so cruelly indifferent. But slowly, something unexpected happened. The grief stopped controlling her. Not because the betrayal hurt less, because she started rebuilding pieces of herself outside the marriage. Quietly, carefully, strategically. Natalie helped her open private accounts Grayson couldn't access. Susie began remote consulting work under a shortened professional name, S. Watkins Consulting. At first, the projects were small. Financial analysis, corporate restructuring recommendations, market projections, nothing glamorous. But the first time a client praised her work during a Zoom meeting, Susie nearly cried after logging off. Because for the first time in years, someone saw her mind before her role as a wife. She started therapy too. Every Thursday afternoon in a discreet office 40 minutes away from Connecticut. At first, Susie hated it. Hated hearing herself say things aloud. My husband cheats on me. My mother-in-law humiliates me. I don't recognize myself anymore. The words sounded pathetic spoken out loud. But her therapist, Dr. Elaine Porter, looked at her one afternoon and said something that stayed with her permanently. Women in emotionally manipulative marriages often confuse endurance with love. Susie sat very still after that. Because she had spent years believing suffering quietly made her loyal, now she wondered if it had only made her disappear. Meanwhile, life inside the Hale household continued almost normally. Almost. Diane Hale became increasingly smug around Susie's silence. At family dinners, Diane would smile approvingly now. "It's nice seeing you calmer these days," she said one evening while sipping white wine. "Marriage gets easier once women stop fighting reality." Grayson chuckled softly beside her. Susie smiled politely. Inside, she memorized every word. Every insult became fuel now. Every humiliation became evidence of exactly why she would eventually leave without guilt. And Grayson Hale grew sloppier. Dangerously sloppy. Because men protected by privilege often mistake silence for stupidity. Susie began noticing unexplained expenses hidden inside their joint financial accounts. Luxury restaurant charges in Manhattan, jewelry purchases, private travel bookings, a monthly payment tied to an LLC she didn't recognize. One night after Grayson fell asleep beside her, Susie quietly slipped from bed and opened her laptop in the dark living room downstairs. Rain hammered against the windows while she searched through months of financial statements. At 2:13 a.m., she found it. A property payment. Consistent. Large. Hidden beneath a corporate reimbursement structure. Her stomach tightened instantly. The address traced back to a luxury condominium in Tribeca, owned under a shell company. Susie's hands trembled slightly as she searched property records online. Then she saw the occupancy paperwork. Vanessa Cole. For several seconds, Susie simply stared at the screen. Grayson had bought Vanessa an apartment. Using marital money, using money Susie helped him build. A sharp laugh escaped her throat before she could stop it. Not because it was funny, because the cruelty had become almost unreal. Grayson walked around acting inconvenienced by her existence while funding another woman's luxury life behind her back. And somehow that discovery changed something fundamental inside Susie. Until that moment, part of her still grieved the marriage emotionally. Now she began seeing it strategically, like Natalie did, like survival required. The next morning, Grayson stood adjusting his cufflinks while Susie made coffee. "You're quiet lately," he observed casually. She handed him a mug. "Maybe I'm finally learning not to argue." He smirked slightly. "There you go." That expression stayed with her long after he left. Not guilt, not concern, relief. Relief that she had become easier to control. Susie waited until his car disappeared down the driveway before opening her hidden office upstairs. Officially, the room was still labeled a guest workspace. In reality, it had become her private war room. Financial documents lined locked drawers. Copies of account statements filled organized folders. Screenshots, photographs, transaction histories, evidence. But there were other things in the room too now, things that belonged only to Susie. Business contracts, consulting reports, professional certifications she renewed secretly online. A framed note from one of her new clients. "Your strategic recommendations saved us millions. Thank you, Susan Watkins. Not Grayson's wife. Not Diane's disappointment. Susan Watkins, the woman she used to be." Some mornings she sat alone in that office, just breathing quietly because it felt like the only room in her life where she still existed fully. Then came the charity gala incident that nearly exposed everything. Vanessa attended openly this time. Not beside Grayson officially, but close enough. Too close. Susie noticed the subtle glances between them immediately, the private smiles, the familiarity. At one point, Vanessa touched Grayson's arm while laughing, and Diane watched the interaction without surprise, without shock, without disapproval. That realization hit harder than expected. Diane knew. Maybe she always had. Later that evening, while guests mingled beneath chandeliers inside the ballroom, Diane cornered Susie near the bar. "You know," Diane said lightly, "a smart woman learns when to tolerate certain things." Susie looked at her carefully. "I'm not sure what you mean." Diane smiled thinly. "Yes, you do." Then she walked away. That was the moment Susie understood something terrifying. The Hale family didn't view betrayal as immoral, only inconvenient. Loyalty mattered only when it protected their image. Nothing else. That night, Susie sat inside her parked car outside their mansion for almost 20 minutes after returning home. The house glowed warmly through enormous windows. Beautiful. Cold. A prison disguised as luxury. Her phone buzzed. "Natalie." Susie answered quietly. "You okay?" Susie stared at the mansion. "No," she admitted softly. A pause. Then Natalie asked the question that mattered most. "Are you ready to stop surviving and start preparing?" Susie closed her eyes. Inside the house, Grayson moved past the upstairs windows, completely unaware his entire life was slowly being documented by the woman he underestimated most. When Susie finally spoke, her voice sounded calmer than she felt. "Yes." Then she looked down at the printed transaction records sitting on the passenger seat beside her. The condo payments, Vanessa's address, proof, solid, real, damning. And for the first time since discovering the affair, Susie didn't feel heartbreak. She felt power. Quiet power. The dangerous kind people never notice until it's too late. "You just buried yourself," she whispered. By the second year of pretending everything was fine, Susie Watkins became frighteningly good at lying with a smile. Not maliciously. Survival taught her. At charity luncheons, she laughed at Diane Hale's cruel jokes, like they no longer mattered. At corporate dinners, she rested her hand lightly on Grayson's arm while he flirted with investors' wives and checked Vanessa's messages beneath the tablecloth. She mastered the art of appearing emotionally harmless, and because of that, nobody noticed she was quietly dismantling the illusion around them piece by piece. Especially Grayson. He still thought she was dependent on him. Still thought her silence meant surrender. That arrogance became his greatest mistake. One icy January morning, Susie sat across from Natalie Brooks inside a private conference room overlooking downtown Boston. Stacks of financial files covered the table. Natalie slid another folder toward her. "I need you to look carefully at page 14. Susie opened the document slowly. Wire transfers, corporate reimbursements, shell entities. At first glance, the paperwork looked impossibly complicated. But after nearly 2 years of secretly rebuilding her financial instincts, patterns had started becoming obvious to her again. And this pattern was ugly. Very ugly. "These accounts are tied to Grayson's company?" Susie asked quietly. Natalie nodded. "And indirectly, tied to Diane." Susie's stomach tightened. Diane always pretended she stayed uninvolved in business matters. Publicly, she played the elegant society wife hosting charity galas and museum fundraisers. But privately, Natalie believed Diane had spent years helping protect hidden family assets. "Look here," Natalie said, pointing at a sequence of transactions. "Money gets transferred through consulting subsidiaries, then redirected into trust accounts." For taxes, Natalie gave her a look. For concealment. The room fell silent. Susie stared down at the numbers while a sick realization slowly formed. The Hale family empire wasn't simply wealthy, it was carefully engineered, protected, hidden. And Grayson had likely planned for divorce long before Susie ever suspected cheating. That thought hurt more than she expected, because affairs could happen impulsively, but financial preparation that required intention, planning, premeditation. He wasn't just betraying her emotionally, he was preparing to erase her completely. "You think he's been moving money for years?" Susie asked. Natalie leaned back calmly. "I think Grayson assumed he'd eventually leave you. Men like him don't risk their lifestyles." The sentence hit hard, not because it shocked her, because deep down she already knew it was true. Suddenly, dozens of memories looked different. Grayson encouraging separate investment structures, Diane insisting family trusts remain protected. The strange tension whenever Susie asked detailed financial questions. They hadn't viewed her as family, only temporary. That afternoon, Susie drove back to Connecticut beneath dark winter skies, feeling physically numb. Snow blurred across the windshield while Natalie's words repeated endlessly in her head. "He was preparing to erase you." When she pulled into the Hale mansion driveway, the house looked as beautiful as ever. Massive stone exterior, warm golden lights glowing through windows. Luxury, security, respectability, everything designed to convince outsiders this family represented success. But now Susie saw something else, rot beneath polish. Grayson sat in the living room speaking sharply into his phone. "No move the transfer before quarter close," he snapped. "I don't care how it looks." Susie paused quietly near the doorway. The second he noticed her, his entire tone changed. Smooth, relaxed. "I'll call you back." He ended the call instantly. "You're home early," he said casually. Susie removed her gloves slowly. Meeting got canceled. Grayson studied her briefly. For one dangerous second, Susie wondered if he could somehow see through her calm expression, but then he smiled faintly. "You should relax more," he said. "You've seemed tense lately." The irony nearly made her laugh. Instead, she nodded politely. "I'm trying." That night, while Grayson slept beside her, Susie lay awake staring into darkness. Not crying, not grieving, thinking, calculating. She suddenly understood why Natalie kept emphasizing strategy over emotion, because emotional pain distracted people, and distracted women lost everything in divorces like this. At 1:17 a.m., Susie quietly slipped from bed and walked downstairs into her hidden office. The room had changed over the years. What began as emotional survival had evolved into preparation. Color-coded folders lined locked cabinets now. Evidence timelines, property records, account histories, photographs, and one wall covered entirely in handwritten notes connecting companies, trusts, and suspicious transfers. It looked almost obsessive. But Susie no longer cared, because every new discovery confirmed the same horrifying truth. The Hale family had never underestimated her intelligence, only her courage. Her laptop chimed softly. New email, unknown sender. Susie froze instantly. The subject line read, "You don't know everything." Her pulse accelerated. Slowly she opened it. No greeting, no signature, only one sentence. "Ask Grayson about Blackwater Holdings before he destroys you, too." Attached beneath the message sat 3 encrypted files. Susie stared at the screen for several long seconds, then immediately called Natalie. Natalie answered on the second ring. "What happened?" Susie explained quickly. Silence followed. Then Natalie's voice hardened. "Do not open those files alone." "Why?" "Because if someone inside the company is contacting you secretly, this is bigger than an affair now." A chill moved through Susie's body. Bigger. The word terrified her. The next afternoon, Susie met Natalie again in Boston. Together, they opened the files inside a secured office computer. The contents made Susie physically sick. Internal ledgers, hidden offshore transactions, unauthorized transfers tied to investor accounts, and one name appearing repeatedly across documents: Blackwater Holdings. "What is this?" Susie whispered. Natalie's expression darkened. Potential fraud. Susie leaned back slowly in her chair. No, but the evidence kept unfolding. Millions moved quietly between entities, financial inconsistencies buried beneath complex structures, and Grayson's approval signatures attached to multiple transactions. The room suddenly felt suffocating. "This could destroy him," Susie said. Natalie looked directly at her. Yes. The terrifying part, Susie wasn't sure how she felt about that, because despite everything, part of her still remembered loving him. Still remembered rooftop bars in Chicago and late-night pizza, and the man who once looked at her like she mattered more than ambition. Grief hit unexpectedly hard then, not for the marriage, for the illusion. The illusion that the man she married still existed somewhere underneath all this corruption. Natalie softened slightly. "You don't have to decide anything today." Susie stared down at the document silently, but before she could answer, another attachment finished loading onto the screen. Audio file labeled "Private Do Not Share." Natalie frowned immediately. "What the hell is this?" Susie clicked play. Static crackled softly, then voices emerged. Male voices, corporate office background noise. And suddenly, Grayson. Susie recognized him instantly, relaxed, laughing, completely unaware he was being recorded. "You think Susie would survive without me?" he scoffed. "She has no idea how the real world works anymore." Men laughed in the background. Then another voice asked, "So when are you finally leaving her?" A pause. Grayson chuckled softly. "Once everything's protected." The recording ended. Silence swallowed the room. Natalie slowly turned towards Susie. But Susie couldn't speak, because in that moment, something inside her finally died completely. Not love. Hope. Hope that somewhere beneath the lies and arrogance, Grayson still cared what happened to her. He didn't. And somehow, accepting that truth made her calmer than she'd felt in years. Susie closed the laptop carefully, then looked out the window at the freezing Boston skyline. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded terrifyingly steady. "He really thought I'd never survive without him." Natalie said nothing. Susie's reflection stared back at her from the darkened glass. Stronger now, colder, awake. Then she whispered the words that would eventually destroy the Hale family forever. "Then I'll make sure he watches me do it." For almost 2 years, Susie Watkins believed the worst part of betrayal was discovering your husband no longer loved you. She was wrong. The worst part was discovering he enjoyed humiliating you while pretending to love you. That realization followed her everywhere after hearing the recording in Natalie's office. "Once everything's protected." The sentence echoed through her mind constantly now. At breakfast, in the shower, while folding laundry inside a mansion paid for partly with her sacrifices. Grayson wasn't trapped in an unhappy marriage. He was strategically managing one, and somehow that hurt more than the affair itself. 3 days after the recording surfaced, Natalie called Susie unexpectedly. "I found the source." Susie straightened immediately in her car. "The anonymous sender." "Yes." A pause. "He wants to meet." Fear moved sharply through Susie's chest. "Who is he?" "Former executive assistant at Grayson's firm. His name is Ethan Mercer." That evening, Susie drove into Manhattan beneath Cold Spring rain. Natalie insisted on accompanying her. You're not meeting someone connected to corporate fraud alone, she said flatly. The meeting took place in a quiet underground jazz bar hidden beneath a luxury hotel in Tribeca. Dim lights, dark leather booths, soft trumpet music filling the air. The kind of place powerful people chose because nobody asked questions there. Ethan Mercer was younger than Susie expected. Mid-30s, sharp suit, exhausted eyes. The moment he saw Susie approaching the booth, genuine guilt crossed his face. "Mrs. Hale," he said quietly. "Susie," she corrected automatically. He nodded once. Natalie remained beside her, observant and unreadable. Ethan wrapped both hands around his untouched whiskey glass. "I almost didn't contact you." Susie sat carefully across from him. "Why did you?" Ethan laughed bitterly. "Because I watched those people destroy everyone around them for years. Those people. Not just Grayson. The entire family." Susie felt suddenly cold. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "You deserve to know what they say about you." Natalie interrupted immediately. "Before we continue, understand something clearly. If this becomes intimidation or manipulation, we walk." Ethan nodded quickly. "I know." Then he looked directly at Susie. "What I'm about to tell you isn't going to feel good." A strange calm settled over her. Nothing has felt good for a long time. For several seconds, Ethan seemed unsure where to begin. Finally, he exhaled heavily. "Grayson talks about you constantly at work." Susie's stomach tightened, not because she hoped he defended her, because she already knew he didn't. Ethan continued carefully. "At first it sounded normal. Typical marriage complaints. But over time," he hesitated. "It got ugly." The jazz music blurred into background noise. Susie focused only on Ethan's voice now. "He called you emotionally dependent. Said you couldn't function without him. Said you were lucky he stayed married because most men would have left already." Each sentence landed like glass beneath her ribs. Natalie's jaw tightened visibly beside her, but Ethan wasn't finished. "One night after a company dinner, someone joked that you seemed too classy for him." Ethan swallowed hard. Grayson laughed and said, "Trust me, she's not as impressive once you live with her." Susie looked down immediately, not because she was crying, because she physically couldn't let Ethan see the devastation on her face. For years, she defended Grayson to everyone, defended his stress, his emotional distance, his cruelty, all while he publicly dismantled her behind her back. "How long?" she asked quietly. Ethan understood immediately. "How long has the affair been happening?" She nodded once. "At least 3 years." The number hit like a punch. 3 years, 3 birthdays, 3 anniversaries. 3 years of sleeping beside a man who came home from another woman's bed and still accepted her loyalty without guilt. Ethan reached into his briefcase slowly. "There's more." Natalie's expression hardened instantly. "What kind of more?" Without answering, Ethan slid a small digital recorder across the table. Susie stared at it silently. "I copied files before I resigned." Ethan admitted, "Mostly because I was scared they'd eventually blame everything on lower employees." Natalie picked up the recorder carefully. "What's on this meetings?" "Conversations, financial discussions." Ethan looked directly at Susie again. "And personal conversations about you." Her chest tightened painfully. Part of her wanted to refuse, to stop hearing new ways Grayson disrespected her. But another part understood something important now. Truth hurts once. Manipulation hurts forever. Natalie pressed play. Static crackled softly. Then Grayson's voice filled the booth. "So what's the plan with Susie?" Another male voice laughed. "You finally divorcing her?" Grayson chuckled casually. "Not until everything's untouchable." More laughter. Then Grayson added something that made Susie physically freeze. "She spent so many years depending on me that she wouldn't survive a month alone." The men laughed again, and someone asked, "You worried she'll fight you in court?" Grayson scoffed immediately, with what money the recording ended. Silence swallowed the booth. Susie stared blankly at the table while her heartbeat thundered painfully inside her ears. Natalie slowly lowered the recorder, but Ethan still looked like he had more to say, and somehow that terrified Susie most. What she whispered. Ethan hesitated, then finally said it. Diane encouraged him. Susie looked up sharply, what Ethan's face hardened with disgust. I heard her myself once. She told Grayson he needed to secure the family legacy before emotional women become expensive. The air vanished from Susie's lungs. No, even Diane wouldn't. She said that. Ethan nodded slowly, and Grayson agreed. Something inside Susie finally broke then. Not outwardly. She didn't scream, didn't cry loudly, but tears slipped silently down her face while she stared at the dark table between them. Because suddenly every cruel comment from Diane looked different. Every insult, every humiliation, every reminder that Susie wasn't truly accepted. It had never been personal dislike. It was strategic dehumanization. If they convinced Susie she was weak long enough eventually, she would believe it too. And a woman who doubts herself becomes easy to control. Natalie touched Susie's wrist gently. Look at me. Susie forced herself to. This is not your shame, Natalie said firmly, but it felt like shame. Deep, humiliating shame. Because she stayed. Because she kept loving people who viewed her as disposable. Ethan looked miserable now. I'm sorry. Susie wiped her face quickly. No, she whispered. Thank you. And she meant it. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, someone finally confirmed she wasn't imagining the cruelty. It was real. All of it. The manipulation, the betrayal, the disrespect. And strangely, clarity began replacing grief again, piece by piece, like armor forming around old wounds. Outside the jazz bar, rain hammered against Manhattan sidewalks while black cars glided through glowing streets. Natalie walked beside Susie silently toward the parking garage. Finally, Susie stopped walking. I wasted years trying to be enough for people who enjoyed making me feel small. Natalie looked at her carefully. No, she corrected softly. You loved people who didn't deserve access to you. The sentence settled deeply inside her. For the first time in years, Susie stopped seeing herself as a rejected wife and started seeing herself as a woman surrounded by predators who mistook kindness for weakness. She stared out at the rain-soaked city lights, then quietly asked the question that mattered most now. What happens next? Natalie's expression sharpened instantly. Now, a long pause. Now we stop protecting him. Susie inhaled slowly. Inside her chest, heartbreak still existed, but something darker existed beside it now. Resolve. Cold. Focused. Dangerous. And somewhere across the city, Grayson Hale still believed his wife would collapse without him. The thought almost made her smile. Then let him underestimate me a little longer, Susie whispered. The night Susie Watkins finally broke down, she did it alone. No dramatic confrontation, no screaming, no shattered wine glasses against marble floors, just silence. Heavy, unbearable silence inside a mansion that had never felt less like home. Grayson was in Miami for a leadership summit. At least that was the story he gave her. Susie no longer bothered checking whether his lies sounded believable. By then, she understood something painful about chronic betrayal. Eventually, the cheating stops shocking you. What destroys you is realizing how long you accepted emotional starvation as normal. Rain hammered against the windows, while Susie wandered barefoot through the enormous house sometime after midnight. The place looked immaculate. Designer furniture, fresh white orchids, perfect lighting, luxury arranged carefully enough to appear effortless. Anyone looking from the outside would think a beautiful, successful couple lived there, but all Susie could see now was evidence of her own disappearance. The dining room where Diane humiliated her during holidays, the staircase where Grayson once walked past her crying without stopping, the kitchen where she spent years pretending coldness was temporary. Every room held a version of herself she barely recognized anymore. She stopped inside the living room and stared at a framed photograph sitting beside the fireplace. Her and Grayson in Santorini. 6 years earlier. She looked genuinely happy. Grayson looked proud to stand beside her. Susie picked up the frame slowly. "What happened to us?" she whispered. But deep down, she already knew the answer. Power happened. Entitlement happened. And little by little, Grayson learned she would survive almost anything to keep the marriage alive. So he kept taking, until nothing remained. The thought hit her harder than expected. Suddenly, Susie sank onto the couch and covered her mouth as sobs finally tore through her chest. Not graceful tears, not cinematic heartbreak, ugly grief. The kind that leaves people shaking. Years of humiliation came crashing down all at once. Diane calling her emotionally weak, Grayson mocking her to coworkers, the fertility treatments, the loneliness, the gaslighting, the endless exhausting effort to earn love from people determined not to give it. "I gave you everything," she cried into empty silence. And the worst part, she meant it literally. Her career, her confidence, her youth, her identity. At some point during the marriage, Susie stopped becoming a person and started becoming emotional infrastructure for everyone else. Supportive wife, polite daughter-in-law, elegant hostess, safe emotional landing place for Grayson's ego, and nobody not once asked what it was costing her. Hours passed before the crying finally stopped. By nearly 3 a.m, Susie sat curled beneath a blanket, staring blankly across the dark living room, emotionally hollow. That was when she noticed the storage box beneath the console table. She frowned slightly. It had been years since she opened it. Curiosity pulled her toward it slowly. Inside sat pieces of an older life. Old notebooks, college photos, business cards, a worn leather planner from Chicago, and near the bottom, a large white envelope. Susie froze instantly. She recognized it immediately. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled it free. Bainbridge Strategic Consulting. New York City, 7 years earlier. The job offer she turned down for Grayson. She slowly unfolded the letter. "Dear Susan Watkins, we are pleased to formally offer you the position of Senior Financial Strategy Consultant." Susie stopped reading. Her vision blurred instantly. She remembered that day perfectly now. She and Grayson sat on the floor of their first apartment eating cheap takeout while she held the offer letter in disbelief. "You have to take it," Grayson said immediately, but 2 weeks later his startup opportunity happened. Connecticut. New investors, a huge career breakthrough. And suddenly, everything changed. "We can't both prioritize ourselves right now," Grayson explained carefully back then. "One of us has to be flexible. One of us..." Funny how sacrifice in marriages almost always translated into women shrinking first. Susie stared at the old acceptance letter while grief twisted sharply through her chest. Not because she regretted loving him, because she regretted abandoning herself completely in the process. That realization changed something. Slowly, quietly. The grief stopped pointing outward toward Grayson and began turning inward toward the woman she neglected for years. By 4 a.m, Susie sat at her kitchen island with her laptop open. Rain still poured outside. The entire mansion remained silent, except for the ticking clock above the stove. She opened LinkedIn for the first time in months, then searched names she hadn't thought about in years. Former coworkers, old mentors, executives from Chicago. Most had advanced dramatically in their careers. Some now led entire firms. And once upon a time, Susie had been one of them. A dangerous voice inside her whispered, "Maybe it's too late now." But another voice, newer, calmer, answered immediately, "Or maybe you're finally ready." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for several long seconds before typing a message to an old contact. Daniel Harper, former managing director. One of the few people who once genuinely respected her professionally. The message was simple. "Hi, Daniel. It's been a long time. I'd love to reconnect if you're open to it." She almost deleted it. Instead, she hit send, then another, then another. By sunrise, Susie had contacted 5 former industry connections. Exhaustion finally pulled her into sleep just after 6 in the morning. She woke 3 hours later to her phone vibrating violently beside her. Disoriented, she answered immediately. "Hello." Susie Daniel Harper's voice. Warm, familiar, professional. "Oh my God." He laughed softly. "Do you know how many people thought you disappeared off the face of the earth?" Susie sat upright instantly. "I guess I kinda did." "Well," Daniel replied, "you shouldn't have." Something emotional tightened painfully inside her chest. He continued before she could answer. "I still remember the restructuring proposal you built for the Carlson deal. Half the executives in Chicago were intimidated by you." Susie blinked hard. Nobody had spoken about her intelligence with admiration in years. Not since before the marriage consumed her identity. Daniel's tone shifted slightly. "I'm actually serious about reconnecting. My firm's expanding strategic consulting divisions in New York." Susie's heartbeat accelerated. "What are you saying I'm saying?" He paused lightly. "If you're interested, I'd love to have dinner and talk." After the call ended, Susie remained frozen at the kitchen counter. Sunlight poured softly through the massive windows now. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel suffocating. It felt temporary, and somehow that changed everything. Upstairs, her phone buzzed again. A text from Grayson. "Flight delayed. Back tomorrow. Miss you." Susie stared at the message expressionlessly. 3 years ago, those words would have comforted her. Now they felt insulting, not because she still wanted him, because he thought she was still emotionally available for manipulation. Calmly, Susie set the phone face down. Then she walked upstairs toward the bedroom mirror. For several seconds, she studied her reflection silently, the same dark hair, the same tired eyes. But something inside them had shifted, not healed yet, but returning. Slowly, the woman staring back at her no longer looked invisible, and for the first time in years, Susie realized something terrifyingly powerful. Grayson Hale was not the center of her story anymore. She was. The first time Susie Watkins walked back into a corporate boardroom, her hand shook so badly she nearly dropped her coffee. Not visibly. Years of high society dinners had taught her how to hide nervousness elegantly, but internally, she felt terrified. The conference room sat 37 floors above Manhattan, wrapped in glass walls overlooking the city skyline. Executives in tailored suits moved confidently around polished black tables, while assistants prepared presentation materials near oversized screens. Everything smelled like ambition, like the life Susie used to belong to. For one dangerous moment, insecurity hit her hard enough to make her want to turn around and leave. "You don't belong here anymore." The voice sounded cruelly familiar. It sounded like Diane. It sounded like Grayson. It sounded like every year Susie spent slowly shrinking herself to survive emotionally. Then Daniel Harper appeared beside her, holding 2 coffees. "There she is." His easy smile immediately grounded her. Daniel looked older than she remembered from Chicago, sharper around the eyes, more gray at his temples, but still carrying the same calm confidence that once intimidated entire conference rooms. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Susie inhaled slowly. "Honestly, always preferred honesty. I feel like I'm about to embarrass myself." Daniel stared at her for one long second, then laughed softly. "Susie, do you know how many people in this industry still remember you?" She looked unconvinced. He handed her a coffee. "You used to walk into negotiations and dismantle executive projections in under 10 minutes. That was a long time ago." "No," Daniel corrected calmly. "That was before someone convinced you to disappear." The sentence landed deeply because that was exactly what had happened. Not all at once, slowly. A woman doesn't wake up one morning without confidence. It gets removed piece by piece. Criticism, neglect, humiliation, gaslighting, until eventually she starts introducing herself smaller than she really is. Daniel lowered his voice slightly. "Trust me, you're still dangerous in a boardroom." Dangerous. The word startled her, because for years the Hale family treated her like she was fragile, emotional, dependent, weak. Nobody had described her as powerful in a very long time. 20 minutes later, Susie sat at the conference table reviewing acquisition reports while executives filtered into the room. Her new consulting role started quietly over the past several months. Small strategy contracts became larger recommendations. Larger recommendations became investor meetings. And now she was consulting for one of the most aggressive investment firms in New York. Officially, Susie worked independently. Unofficially, she was rebuilding herself. Every successful meeting restored another piece of identity Grayson slowly erased. She started dressing differently too. Not for men, not for revenge, for herself. Tailored cream coats, sharp black heels, minimal jewelry, controlled elegance. She no longer dressed like someone begging to be chosen. She dressed like someone who already chose herself. The boardroom doors opened again. Susie barely looked up at first, then froze instantly. Grayson Hale walked inside. The world seemed to stop moving. He wore a charcoal suit she once helped pick out for him in Milan. Confident posture, expensive watch, familiar cold charisma. For one horrifying second, Susie forgot how to breathe. Grayson glanced casually around the room, then saw her. Everything in his expression changed immediately. Shock, confusion, disbelief. It happened so quickly most people wouldn't notice. But Susie did, because for the first time in years she held the power of surprise. Mr. Hale, one executive, greeted smoothly. "Good to see you." Grayson's eyes remained locked on Susie several seconds too long before he recovered professionally. "You too." His voice sounded tighter now, controlled, careful. Susie lowered her gaze calmly toward her notes again, like his presence barely affected her. Inside her pulse thundered violently. "Do not react emotionally." Natalie's voice echoed inside her head automatically. The meeting began. Financial projections, acquisition risks, market positioning, normal corporate conversation. But tension vibrated beneath every word now, because Grayson couldn't stop looking at her. Not openly, just constantly enough to reveal his unease. Finally, midway through the presentation, one investor turned toward Susie. "Ms. Watkins, based on your review, what's your assessment of Hale Capital's vulnerabilities?" The room went silent. Susie looked up slowly. Across the table, Grayson stared at her carefully now, trying to understand, trying to regain control. For years, he viewed her only inside the role of wife. Now she existed outside his narrative completely, and it unsettled him. Susie folded her hands calmly. Hale Capital has strong public positioning she began professionally, but internally the company appears over-leveraged in several expansion areas. Grayson's jaw tightened slightly. She continued smoothly. There's also concerning opacity surrounding several subsidiary structures. One executive nodded thoughtfully. Potential compliance exposure. Potentially, Susie answered carefully. She never once looked directly at Grayson while dismantling weaknesses inside his company structure with terrifying precision, and that was the moment he finally understood something important. Susie was no longer financially helpless. The realization visibly disturbed him. After the meeting ended, executives filtered toward elevators discussing investment concerns quietly among themselves. Grayson intercepted her near the hallway. What the hell was that? His voice remained low and controlled, but anger simmered underneath it. Susie turned calmly. A business meeting. You're consulting now? I always was capable of it. The answer hit harder than an insult. Grayson stared at her carefully. For a moment he looked genuinely unsettled, not because she embarrassed him, because he suddenly realized how much he underestimated her. You never mentioned this, he said. Susie almost laughed. You never asked, but instead she smiled politely. You never seemed interested in my career. That silence between them stretched painfully long. Then Grayson noticed something else. Confidence. Not performative confidence. Real confidence. The kind she used to have before the marriage hollowed her out emotionally, and for the first time in years he looked at her like he didn't fully recognize the woman standing in front of him. You seem different, he admitted quietly. Susie tilted her head slightly. Maybe I got tired of being underestimated. Before he could respond, her phone vibrated. Diane Hale. Of course. Susie stared at the screen briefly before answering. Hello? Diane's voice sounded unusually warm. Susie, sweetheart, we haven't had lunch together in forever. Susie exchanged a quick glance with Grayson. Interesting. Very interesting. Because Diane only became kind when she wanted something. I've been busy, Susie replied smoothly. Well, Diane continued brightly, I'd love to see you tomorrow. Just us girls. Susie almost smiled. Diane knew something, or sensed something. Either way, fear had entered the Hale family somewhere, and fear made dangerous people careless. I'll see if I can make time, Susie answered calmly. After hanging up, Grayson watched her carefully. What did my mother want? Susie slipped her phone into her purse. No idea. Then she walked away before he could stop her. Inside the elevator descending toward Manhattan streets, Susie finally allowed herself one slow breath. Her reflection stared back at her from mirrored walls. Elegant, composed, powerful. Not healed yet, but transforming. For years, Grayson believed he was standing beside a woman too emotionally dependent to survive without him. Today, for the first time, he looked genuinely afraid he might have been wrong. And somehow, that felt better than revenge. Diane Hale chose the restaurant carefully. Of course she did. Everything about Diane was calculated. The private dining club overlooked Central Park through towering glass windows filled with quiet, old-money elegance and people who spoke softly because wealth had taught them they never needed to raise their voices. Susie Watkins arrived 10 minutes early, not out of politeness, out of strategy. She wanted time to observe the room before Diane arrived. The hostess guided her toward a secluded corner table beside the windows. Soft piano music floated through the restaurant while Manhattan shimmered beneath gray afternoon skies outside. Susie removed her coat calmly and sat down. A year ago, lunch with Diane would have filled her with anxiety. Now she felt curious. Because fear changes direction eventually. And for the first time in their entire relationship, Susie sensed Diane was the nervous one. Exactly 12 minutes later, Diane entered wearing cream cashmere and diamonds subtle enough to cost more than most people's yearly salaries. Elegant, cold, perfectly composed. But Susie noticed something immediately. Diane looked tired. Not physically, emotionally, and that alone felt shocking. Susie Diane greeted warmly, leaning in for an air kiss. "You look wonderful." Translation, "You look harder to control." Susie smiled politely. "So do you." Diane sat gracefully across from her and ordered sparkling water before even opening the menu. Classic Diane. Control the atmosphere before conversation begins. For several minutes, they discussed harmless topics: charity events, Connecticut weather, a museum fundraiser. The performance was almost impressive. If Susie hadn't spent years decoding Diane's manipulation patterns, she might have believed the warmth was genuine. Then Diane finally shifted the conversation. "I heard you've been consulting again?" There it was. Susie stirred her coffee slowly. "Some small projects." Diane smiled too carefully. Grayson seemed surprised. I imagine he was. A flicker crossed Diane's face. Not anger, calculation. "You know how stressful things have been for him lately." Susie nearly laughed at the audacity. Stressful. Interesting way to describe affairs, hidden assets, and potential financial crimes. Instead, she replied softly, "I'm sure." Diane leaned forward slightly. "You've always been intelligent, Susie. I hope you understand how fragile reputations can be in certain industries." Ah, now they were finally speaking honestly. Not openly, but honestly. Susie met Diane's gaze directly. "Is this lunch about my career?" A pause. Then Diane sighed dramatically. "You've become defensive lately." No, she'd become harder to manipulate. There was a difference. The waiter arrived briefly with appetizers, interrupting the tension long enough for Diane to regain her polished expression. Once they were alone again, Diane lowered her voice. Families survive difficult seasons by protecting each other. Susie felt something cold settle inside her chest. Families. Interesting word choice from a woman who spent years making her feel unwanted. "Did you ever consider me family?" Susie asked quietly. Diane blinked. The question clearly caught her off guard. Of course, it was a lie. A graceful one, but still a lie. Susie remembered every insult too clearly. Every reminder she wasn't enough. Not sophisticated enough. Not fertile enough. Not obedient enough. Women like Diane didn't want daughters-in-law. They wanted emotional servants for their sons. Diane folded her hands carefully. Grayson has worked very hard to build his company. There it was again. Not marriage, not loyalty, not emotional damage. Money, image, protection. Susie leaned back slightly, and Diane hesitated for the first time. Actual hesitation. That alone confirmed everything. Then finally, there are rumors circulating among investors. Susie kept her expression neutral. About compliance reviews, acquisition pressure, questions about internal structures. Translation. They were scared. A dangerous warmth spread quietly through Susie's chest. Not joy. Validation. For years, Diane made her feel powerless. Now the Hale family empire finally looked vulnerable. And suddenly, Diane remembered Susie existed. "How unfortunate," Susie replied calmly. Diane studied her carefully now, searching, trying to understand how much Susie knew. "How involved are you with these investment groups?" There it was, the real reason for lunch. Not reconciliation, information gathering. Susie almost admired the desperation beneath Diane's elegance. "Why does that matter?" she asked lightly. Diane's smile tightened. Because despite everything, I care about this family. Susie stared at her for several seconds, then quietly asked the question she'd wanted answered for years. Did you know Grayson was cheating silence? Real silence this time. Diane looked toward the windows briefly before answering. Marriage is complicated. Not denial, not shock, not outrage. Complicated. Susie felt physically ill, because somewhere deep down she still hoped Diane would at least pretend to condemn him. Instead, she protected him instinctively, like preserving male comfort mattered more than another woman's devastation. You knew, Susie whispered. Diane's expression hardened slightly. I knew men make mistakes, and women are supposed to tolerate humiliation quietly. Diane lowered her voice sharply. You're being emotional. The phrase hit differently now, not painful, predictable. Emotion was always weaponized against women who noticed mistreatment. Susie smiled faintly. No, I'm finally being honest. For the first time during lunch, Diane lost composure completely. Only briefly, but Susie saw it. Fear. Not fear of divorce. Fear of exposure. You need to think carefully about what happens if Grayson's company suffers, Diane said quietly. A lot of lives are connected to that business. Manipulation again. Make her responsible for consequences caused by men. Classic. Susie stood slowly, placing her napkin beside the untouched dessert plate. Diane looked startled. We're done already. Susie picked up her coat calmly. I think we finished the real conversation 20 minutes ago. Susie. Then it happened. The thing Susie never expected. Diane Hale's voice cracked slightly, not dramatically, barely noticeable, but enough. Please, Diane said quietly, don't destroy this family. The words froze the air between them. For years, Susie dreamed about hearing Diane vulnerable, apologetic, human. But standing there now, she realized something devastating. Diane still wasn't asking because she cared about Susie's pain, only because consequences were finally approaching her own doorstep, and somehow that made everything sadder. Susie looked down at the woman who spent years teaching her she was small, then answered softly, You should have thought about family before you helped destroy mine. Diane's face drained slightly of color. For the first time ever, she had no immediate response. No elegant insult. No manipulation. Just silence. Susie turned and walked toward the exit without looking back. Outside, cold Manhattan winds swept through the streets, while black cars rushed past glowing storefronts. Her phone buzzed before she even reached the corner. Grayson. Of course. She answered calmly. How did lunch go? He asked casually, too casually, meaning Diane already contacted him. Interesting. It was enlightening. A pause. What does that mean? Susie smiled faintly to herself while waiting at the crosswalk. It means your mother's finally afraid. Silence. Then Grayson laughed nervously. You're being dramatic. No, she was being observant. The light changed. Susie crossed the street slowly beneath towering Manhattan buildings, feeling strangely calm. Because for years the Hale family operated from certainty. Certainty that Susie would stay. Stay quiet, stay loyal, stay weak. But certainty becomes dangerous when people stop questioning their own power. And somewhere behind her, inside expensive restaurants and glass boardrooms and carefully protected family trusts, fear had finally entered the Hale family. Susie could feel it. And fear made arrogant people reckless. Grayson Hale started noticing the change in his wife, the same way most arrogant men notice danger. Too late. At first it was subtle. Susie stopped asking where he was, stopped checking the time when he came home late, stopped trying to fill silences during dinner. And strangely, that unsettled him more than arguments ever did. Because conflict still meant emotional investment. Calmness meant distance. One Thursday evening, Grayson walked into the kitchen expecting the usual version of his life. Soft music playing, dinner waiting, Susie moving quietly around the marble counters while pretending not to notice his emotional absence. Instead, he found her sitting alone at the island in silk pajamas, typing calmly on her laptop. She barely looked up when he entered. "You're home early," she said. No warmth, no irritation either, just observation. Grayson loosened his tie slowly. "What are you working on, consulting reports?" Again with that word. Consulting. Every time he heard it lately, something sharp tightened inside his chest. Not because Susie working bothered him, because it disrupted the image he carried of her in his mind. Dependent, safe, predictable. Now she was becoming difficult to read, and people like Grayson hated uncertainty. He opened the refrigerator absently. "You've been busy lately. So have you." The answer landed carefully between them. Neutral on the surface, dangerous underneath. Grayson studied her quietly. Susie looked different now, not physically, though she carried herself differently too somehow. Straighter posture, sharper eyes, more controlled elegance. But the real difference was emotional. She no longer watched him constantly, no longer sought reassurance in his tone or expressions. And once he noticed that shift, he couldn't stop noticing it. It followed him everywhere. At social events, Susie mingled independently instead of orbiting around him. At dinners, she laughed genuinely with other people while barely reacting to his attention. Even Diane commented on it privately one afternoon. "She's changed," Diane murmured while reviewing gala seating arrangements. Grayson frowned slightly. "She's working again." "No," Diane replied carefully. "It's more than that." Then she lowered her voice. "She doesn't seem emotionally attached anymore." The statement irritated him immediately. Don't be dramatic. But later that night, he found himself watching Susie differently. She stood at the bathroom mirror removing earrings slowly, while soft lighting reflected across the marble walls. Beautiful, composed, distant. Grayson suddenly realized he couldn't remember the last time she cried in front of him. That should have felt easier. Instead, it made him strangely uneasy. Meanwhile, Vanessa became increasingly demanding. At first, the affair felt exciting, easy. Vanessa admired him openly, desired him constantly, never challenged his ego. But affairs built on fantasy eventually collide with reality, and reality always costs something. "You said you were leaving her," Vanessa snapped one evening inside her Tribeca condo. Grayson sighed heavily. "Lower your voice." Vanessa crossed her arms. "It's been 3 years, Grayson. 3 years." Hearing it spoken aloud irritated him more than expected. "Things are complicated." Vanessa laughed bitterly. "Oh, funny. That's exactly what married men always say." Grayson rubbed his forehead. The pressure around the company had intensified lately. Investors asked sharper questions. Acquisition reviews became increasingly invasive. Even Diane sounded nervous during phone calls now. The last thing he needed was emotional chaos. But Vanessa refused to stay quiet anymore. "I'm tired of being hidden." "You're not hidden." She stared at him incredulously. "You leave my apartment and go home to your wife every night." The sentence landed harder than it should have, because lately even the word wife felt complicated in ways he couldn't explain. Not emotionally, strategically. Something about Susie felt different now. Slippery. Like she was quietly moving beyond his reach without him understanding how. A few days later, the feeling intensified. Grayson arrived home unexpectedly early after a canceled investor dinner. The house was quiet. Warm light glowed softly from Susie's upstairs office. Her office. That room used to be storage. Now the door stayed locked more often than not. Grayson climbed the stairs slowly and paused outside. He heard her laughing softly inside. Laughing. Not polite social laughter. Real laughter. He couldn't remember the last time he caused that sound. Something ugly twisted unexpectedly inside his chest. Jealousy. The realization irritated him immediately. He knocked once before opening the door. Susie looked up from her desk, surprised. A laptop sat open beside scattered documents and notebooks. She quickly minimized something on screen. "Hey," she said calmly, "who were you talking to?" The question came out sharper than intended. Susie blinked once. Daniel Harper. Grayson recognized the name instantly. The investor consultant from New York. The same man from the boardroom. "Why is he calling you at night?" Susie leaned back slightly. "We were discussing a client presentation." Grayson stared at her carefully. There it was again, that calmness. No defensiveness, no anxiety, no desperate need to reassure him. It unsettled him more than anger would have. "You seem close," he said casually. Susie almost smiled. The irony was unbelievable. For years, he disappeared emotionally into another woman's arms while expecting unwavering trust. Now, one professional phone call disturbed him. "He's a colleague," she answered simply. Grayson remained standing in the doorway. Something about the room bothered him too. Notebooks, financial reports, focused energy, purpose. Susie looked alive inside this space. More alive than she ever looked beside him lately. "You've changed," he said quietly. This time Susie didn't deny it. "Yes." The directness caught him off guard. Grayson frowned slightly. "What happened to you?" The question hung heavily between them. What happened to you? Such a dangerous question. Because the truthful answer was, you did. Your betrayal, your cruelty, your indifference, your entitlement. But Susie only closed her laptop gently and stood. For a brief moment they faced each other in silence beneath warm office lighting, and suddenly Grayson experienced something deeply unfamiliar. Fear. Not fear of losing the marriage. Fear of losing control over the narrative he built about her. Because Susie Watkins was no longer behaving like a devastated woman, desperate to keep her husband. She was behaving like someone preparing for life beyond him. That realization terrified him more than he wanted to admit. "Are you seeing someone else?" he asked suddenly. The second the words left his mouth, even he realized how absurd they sounded. Susie stared at him silently, then slowly, almost unbelievably, she laughed. Not cruelly, just softly, disbelievingly, and somehow that hurt his ego more than shouting ever could. "You think I'm cheating on you?" she asked quietly. Grayson shifted uncomfortably. "I'm just asking." Interesting. Now he was asking questions. Now he wanted emotional clarity, after years of denying it to her. Susie walked toward the doorway slowly until only inches separated them. Then she looked directly into his eyes and delivered the sentence that would haunt him later. "That's because you never cared enough to really know me." Grayson's expression changed instantly. The words hit somewhere deeper than accusation, because part of him understood they were true. For years he treated Susie like emotional furniture, reliable, supportive, always there, and now suddenly she existed outside his understanding completely. It unnerved him, deeply. Susie stepped past him calmly toward the staircase, but before she disappeared downstairs, Grayson spoke again. "Suze..." She paused slightly. He hadn't called her that in years. "I don't know what's happening between us." Susie stood still for several seconds, then answered without turning around. That's because you stopped paying attention a long time ago." And with that, she walked away, leaving Grayson alone inside the office where his wife had quietly rebuilt herself without him noticing. For the first time in years, Grayson Hale realized something terrifying. Susie Watkins no longer needed him emotionally, and men like Grayson often confuse being needed with being loved. The Hale family anniversary dinner began exactly the way Susie Watkins expected. Expensive wine, artificial laughter, and cruelty hidden beneath polished smiles. Diane Hale's mansion glowed beneath golden evening lights, while luxury cars lined the circular driveway outside. Inside, wealthy guests drifted through marble hallways, carrying champagne glasses and gossip disguised as conversation. Old money Connecticut elegance, beautiful from a distance, rotten underneath. Susie stood alone near the staircase for a brief moment before entering the dining room. Tonight mattered, not because she still wanted revenge, because she was finally done surviving quietly. Her black silk dress fit perfectly. Diamond earrings caught the chandelier light softly, hair pinned elegantly above one shoulder. For the first time in years, she dressed entirely for herself, not to impress Grayson, not to please Diane, not to appear acceptable enough for people who enjoyed diminishing her. When Susie entered the dining room, several conversations paused subtly. People noticed her now. Confidence changes the way rooms react to women. Grayson certainly noticed. He stood near the fireplace speaking with investors when his eyes landed on her. For a split second, genuine emotion crossed his face. Not annoyance, not indifference. Something more dangerous. Regret. But it disappeared quickly beneath practiced composure. "You look beautiful," he said quietly when she approached. The compliment startled her only because it sounded sincere. "Too late." Susie smiled politely. "Thank you." Diane appeared seconds later wearing silver silk and diamonds heavy enough to look almost royal. "Everyone's finally here," she announced brightly. Then her eyes swept over Susie carefully and paused. Diane sensed it too, the difference. Not in appearance, in energy. Susie no longer entered rooms seeking permission to exist. That unsettled women like Diane deeply. Dinner began beneath crystal chandeliers and carefully curated family photographs lining the walls. Every image displayed the same illusion: the Hales were successful, stable, untouchable. Carter Hale sat quietly near the end of the table, sipping bourbon with growing exhaustion etched across his aging face. Unlike Diane, Carter never enjoyed emotional games. He simply ignored them, which Susie realized eventually made him complicit anyway. Conversation flowed around investment markets, Hampton's properties, and political fundraising dinners, while servers moved gracefully between guests. Across the table, Grayson checked his phone constantly. Susie already knew why. Vanessa, of course. At some point during the appetizer course, Diane lifted her wine glass lightly. "I just want to say how proud I am of family," she announced warmly. Several guests smiled politely. Diane continued. "In today's world, loyalty matters more than ever." The irony almost made Susie laugh. Instead, she sipped water calmly. Then Diane turned toward her directly. "And Susie," she added sweetly, "you've certainly been fortunate to have Grayson taking care of you all these years." There it was. The performance. Public humiliation disguised as affection. Several guests shifted awkwardly in their seats. Grayson stayed silent. Again, because silence had always protected the wrong people in this family. Diane smiled wider. "Honestly, without my son, you probably wouldn't survive 6 months in the real world." A few uncomfortable laughs scattered around the table. Susie slowly placed her wine glass down. Not embarrassed, not emotional, just finished. Across from her, Grayson finally muttered Mom. But Diane continued smoothly, "Oh, don't look so serious. I'm complimenting you, sweetheart. Not every woman gets the luxury of being protected." Protected. Interesting word, because prison walls also protect people from the outside world. For years, comments like this would have devastated Susie. Tonight, she almost pitied Diane instead, because Diane still believed fear controlled her, and people become incredibly dangerous once they stop being afraid. The room quieted gradually. Something in Susie's expression had changed. People sensed it instinctively. Even Grayson looked uneasy now. Very calmly, Susie reached for her purse beside the chair. Diane kept smiling, still performing, still certain she controlled the narrative. "Tell me I'm wrong," Diane teased lightly. Susie looked directly at her, then answered softly, "You are." Silence. Complete silence. Even the servers stopped moving. Diane blinked once. "What?" Susie folded her hands carefully atop the table. "For years you convinced yourself I stayed because I couldn't survive without Grayson." Her voice remained calm, controlled, terrifyingly calm. "But the truth is," she smiled faintly, "I stayed because I loved him." Grayson stared at her now without blinking. Real fear entered his expression for the first time all evening. Susie continued, "And unfortunately for both of you, love made me tolerate things that self-respect never should have." Diane's smile faded slightly. "Susie, this isn't the time." "No," Susie interrupted gently. "Actually, I think it finally is." Grayson shifted beside her. "Suze, maybe we should." She ignored him completely. For years they interrupted her emotions whenever truth became uncomfortable. Tonight, nobody interrupted her. Not anymore. Very slowly, Susie removed a sealed envelope from her purse and placed it on the white tablecloth. The sound alone seemed to echo through the room. Several guests exchanged nervous glances. Carter lowered his bourbon glass quietly. Diane's face tightened. "What is that?" Susie looked at her calmly. The truth. A chill moved visibly through the room. Grayson's voice dropped dangerously low. "Susie." But she still didn't look at him. Not yet. Because this moment wasn't about his reactions anymore. It was about reclaiming her voice in the exact room where they spent years trying to erase it. Susie slid photographs onto the table first. Hotel entrances. Kisses beneath Manhattan's snowfall. Vanessa entering Grayson's condo building. The blood drained from Diane's face instantly. Several guests looked away uncomfortably. One woman whispered, "Oh my God." Grayson grabbed the photographs immediately. "Are you insane?" There it was. The favorite word men use when women stop protecting their secrets. Susie finally turned toward him, and for the first time in years, Grayson looked genuinely shaken by what he saw in her eyes. Nothing. No desperation, no heartbreak, no pleading, only clarity. "You cheated on me for 3 years," she said softly, "using marital money to fund another woman's life while your mother mocked me at family dinners." Diane stood abruptly. "This is inappropriate." Susie looked at her calmly. "Inappropriate," she repeated. "No, Diane. What was inappropriate was humiliating me publicly while knowing exactly what your son was doing." Silence crushed the room again, because now everyone understood. Diane knew. She always knew. Grayson's composure began cracking visibly. "Can we do this privately?" No, Susie answered immediately. The single word stunned him, because Susie always protected him publicly before. Always. Not tonight. Very carefully, she opened the envelope fully and removed another stack of documents. Legal papers, financial records, evidence. Natalie Brooks stepped quietly into the dining room entrance right on time. Elegant, controlled, deadly. Diane looked horrified. "Oh my God!" Natalie approached calmly and placed official documents beside Grayson's plate. "You've been served." Several guests gasped audibly. Grayson stood so quickly his chair scraped violently across hardwood floors. "Susie, what the hell are you doing?" She met his eyes finally, and the room disappeared around them for one long, painful moment. Because beneath all the betrayal, part of her still mourned the man she thought he once was. But grief no longer outweighed self-respect. "You spent years preparing to leave me with nothing," she said quietly. Grayson froze. The expression on his face confirmed everything. He never imagined she knew. "You underestimated me," Susie whispered. And suddenly, for the first time all night, Grayson Hale looked afraid. Real fear, not of losing his wife, of losing control. Nobody moved. That was the first thing Susie Watkins noticed after Natalie Brooks placed the divorce papers on the dining table. Silence swallowed the room so completely that even the soft clink of melting ice inside Carter Hale's bourbon glass sounded painfully loud. Grayson remained standing beside his chair, gripping the edge of the table hard enough for his knuckles to pale. "What the hell is this?" he demanded again. But this time his voice lacked authority, because everyone in the room already understood something important. Susie was no longer reacting emotionally. She was prepared, and prepared women terrified men who relied on control. Natalie remained calm beside the doorway, one hand resting lightly over her leather portfolio. "Mr. Hale," she said professionally, "you've officially been served divorce papers alongside preliminary financial disclosure requests." Diane looked seconds away from collapse. "This is insane," she snapped sharply. "You're humiliating this family publicly." Susie finally turned toward her slowly. "No, Diane," she replied softly, "your family did that to itself." Across the table, several guests avoided eye contact completely now. Others stared openly, not because wealthy people hated scandal, because they loved witnessing powerful people fall, especially people like the Hales who spent years acting untouchable. Grayson threw the photographs onto the table angrily. "You hired someone to follow me?" The accusation almost made Susie laugh. Interesting how betrayal always became the victim's fault once evidence appeared. "You cheated on me for 3 years," she said calmly. "I documented the truth. That doesn't give you the right to ambush me like this." Ambush. Another fascinating word. As if she hadn't spent years emotionally ambushed inside her own marriage. Diane stood abruptly. "We are not discussing family matters in front of guests." Natalie's expression sharpened slightly. "With respect," she interrupted, "the financial matters involved here may soon become public regardless." The room shifted instantly. Fear. Real fear. Carter finally spoke for the first time all evening. What financial matters? Grayson shot Natalie a murderous glare. "You need to leave." But Natalie ignored him completely. "Mrs. Watkins has substantial evidence regarding hidden marital assets, undisclosed transfers, and misuse of joint finances." One investor sitting halfway down the table stiffened visibly. Grayson noticed immediately, and panic flashed across his face. There it is, Susie thought quietly, the first crack. Because Grayson never feared emotional consequences, only financial ones. What evidence? Carter demanded sharply. Susie reached calmly into the envelope again and slid several printed transaction reports across the table. Luxury condo payments, offshore transfers, Blackwater Holdings records, Vanessa's apartment expenses, all funded indirectly through concealed structures. Diane's face lost all remaining color. Grayson stepped toward Susie suddenly. "Enough." Not loud. Worse. Controlled rage, the kind that once intimidated her instantly. But Susie no longer flinched. Not emotionally, not physically. Why, she asked quietly, "Afraid people will finally see who you are." His jaw tightened violently. "You have no idea what you're talking about." The lie sounded weak now, desperate. Natalie stepped forward calmly. "We also have recordings." That sentence detonated through the room. Diane looked physically ill. Carter stared sharply at his son. "Recordings." Grayson's composure cracked visibly for the first time. "Susie," he warned softly. Too soft. Too dangerous. A year ago, that tone would have terrified her. Tonight, it only exhausted her. "You spent years convincing me I was weak," she said quietly. "You mocked me to your coworkers while I defended you to everyone in my life." Grayson's expression shifted. Not guilt, calculation. He was trying to determine how much she truly knew. How long, he asked carefully. Susie smiled faintly. "Long enough." One of the guests, a silver-haired investor named Richard Bennett, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Grayson, are these allegations connected to the compliance concerns surrounding Hale Capital?" There it was. The real nightmare. Not divorce, not infidelity. Reputation collapse. Grayson immediately straightened. "This is a personal matter being exaggerated emotionally." Emotionally, of course. The favorite refuge of manipulative men once facts become inconvenient. Susie looked directly at Richard. "There are active financial irregularities tied to several internal subsidiaries." The room exploded into overlapping voices immediately. "What Jesus Christ, is this true?" Diane slammed her hand against the table. "Stop this right now." But nobody listened anymore, because the illusion was breaking too fast. Phones began lighting up across the table. Notifications, messages, emails. One executive stood abruptly and walked toward the hallway, answering a call in hushed panic. Grayson noticed, and for the first time all night, he looked genuinely frightened. Not angry, not offended, frightened. The emotional shift hit Susie harder than expected, because suddenly she realized something devastating. Grayson truly believed he would never face consequences. Not for cheating, not for humiliating her, not even for financial corruption. Men like him survive through certainty. Certainty that loyalty can be bought. Certainty that women stay quiet. Certainty that power protects them forever. Tonight, that certainty was collapsing in front of everyone. "Susie," Grayson said carefully, stepping closer again, "we can fix this privately. Fix. Interesting. Not apologize, not explain. Fix. Like she was a public relations problem instead of a devastated human being." "No," she answered softly. The word landed harder than shouting. "Because it was final." Diane suddenly pointed toward Natalie furiously. "You manipulated her into this." Natalie nearly smiled. "No, Mrs. Hale. I simply helped her realize she deserved better." The sentence cut through the room cleanly. Diane opened her mouth again, then stopped abruptly because the dining room doors opened, and Vanessa Cole walked inside. Furious. Beautiful. Completely unaware she'd just entered a disaster. Every head turned instantly. Vanessa froze the second she saw the room. The photographs, the legal documents, Grayson's pale expression. Then her eyes landed on Susie. Understanding hit immediately. "Oh my God." Grayson moved toward her quickly. "Vanessa, not now. Not now. As if there would eventually be an appropriate moment for your mistress to arrive during your marriage implosion." Vanessa looked around the table in disbelief. "You told me you handled this." Handled. The word echoed brutally. Not marriage, not heartbreak. Handled. Like Susie was merely paperwork delaying their future together. Diane looked seconds away from cardiac arrest. "This woman needs to leave immediately." Vanessa laughed bitterly. "Oh, now I'm the problem." Grayson lowered his voice sharply. Stop talking." And suddenly Vanessa's expression changed. Years of secrecy, false promises, humiliation. It all surfaced at once. "No," she snapped. "I'm done protecting you." The room went silent again. Dangerous silence. The kind before detonations. Susie watched Grayson carefully now, because for the first time in years he looked powerless, actually powerless, and strangely, she felt nothing. No triumph, no revenge fantasy, just exhaustion. Deep emotional exhaustion from carrying love for someone who never deserved it. Across the table, Carter Hale slowly removed his glasses. His face looked older suddenly. "What did you do?" he asked quietly. "Not to Susie. To his son." Grayson looked cornered now. Every exit collapsing simultaneously. Investors whispering, phones buzzing, mistress furious, wife emotionally untouchable, and mother finally unable to control the narrative. For years, Susie imagined this moment differently. She thought revenge would feel satisfying, victorious. Instead, watching Grayson unravel only made her mourn the life she wasted loving him. Natalie stepped beside her quietly. "You okay?" Susie looked around the shattered dining room, at the fear, the panic, the collapsing illusion, then finally answered honestly. For the first time in years, she inhaled slowly. "Yes." Across the room, Grayson stared directly at her, and the most terrifying realization finally hit him completely. Susie Watkins was never the weak one in this marriage. She was simply the only one who loved honestly. Chaos spread through the Hale mansion like fire through dry wood. Guests whispered in corners. Phones vibrated nonstop across the dining table. Someone near the bar quietly muttered the words "federal investigation," and suddenly the entire atmosphere shifted from scandal to catastrophe. But the loudest thing in the room wasn't the panic. It was Vanessa Cole finally telling the truth. "You lied to me too!" She snapped at Grayson, her voice shaking with fury. "For 3 years." Vanessa Grayson warned sharply. "Stop." "No!" The single word sliced through the room. Susie Watkins remained seated at the dining table, strangely calm now, while Vanessa stepped farther into the room like a woman finally too angry to stay silent. The irony wasn't lost on Susie. For years, both women existed inside different versions of Grayson's manipulation. One as the loyal wife, one as the promised future. Neither fully understanding the other was being lied to, too. Vanessa laughed bitterly, wiping at angry tears beneath smudged mascara. "You told me the divorce was almost finalized." She looked around the room wildly. "You told me she was emotionally unstable and dependent on you." Several guests exchanged deeply uncomfortable looks. Grayson's face darkened instantly. "Enough!" No, Vanessa shot back. "You don't get to control this anymore." The sentence landed heavily, because that was the real theme of the entire night. Loss of control. Diane stepped forward furiously. "You have destroyed enough already!" Vanessa turned toward her sharply. "Oh, please!" She laughed coldly. "You knew about me the entire time." The room fell silent again. Carter Hale slowly closed his eyes. Diane's expression hardened with desperate dignity. "I tolerated mistakes for the sake of family stability." There it is, Susie thought quietly. Not morality, image, always image. Vanessa pointed directly at Diane. "You told Grayson Susie would never leave him because she didn't have the backbone for independence." Diane paled instantly. Susie felt something twist painfully inside her chest. Not surprise, confirmation. Even now, hearing the words aloud still hurt. Because cruelty sounds uglier once spoken publicly. Grayson stepped toward Vanessa aggressively. "You need to leave." Vanessa looked at him with genuine disgust now. "No," she whispered. "You're just scared she finally knows who you are." That sentence hit harder than anything else all night, because Susie did know now, completely. Not the charming version, not the ambitious version, not the man she once loved in Chicago. The real Grayson Hale, a man who needed admiration more than intimacy, control more than partnership, ego more than love. And suddenly she felt tired, so deeply tired. While the room spiraled into disaster around her, Susie realized revenge no longer interested her. Truth did. Across the dining room, one investor quietly stood and buttoned his jacket. "I think it's best we continue certain discussions Monday morning," he muttered awkwardly before leaving. Others followed quickly. The social damage had already begun, because wealthy people forgive infidelity privately all the time. What they don't forgive is instability, and tonight the Hale family looked unstable, dangerously unstable. Diane noticed it too. Panic finally overtook her polished composure completely. "You are ruining everything," she hissed towards Susie. For years, those words would have devastated her. Tonight, Susie simply looked back calmly. "No," she answered softly. "I stopped saving it. The distinction mattered. Very much. Because Susie didn't destroy the Hale family. She merely stopped protecting them from consequences." Vanessa laughed bitterly again. "You think she ruined him," she snapped toward Diane. "Grayson ruined himself." Then she turned back toward Susie, and for the first time all night, the anger in her expression softened slightly. "He used both of us differently," Vanessa admitted quietly. The honesty startled Susie. Vanessa looked exhausted now, not glamorous, not triumphant, just emotionally wrecked. "He promised me a future while mocking you behind your back," she continued, "and he promised you loyalty while sleeping in my bed." Grayson looked furious. "Stop talking!" But Vanessa was finally past fear. "You know what he used to say about you?" she asked Susie quietly. Natalie Brooks immediately stepped closer protectively. "You don't have to hear this." But Susie already knew she did, because painful truth was still better than beautiful manipulation. Vanessa swallowed hard. "He said you'd become boring because you loved him too much." The sentence hit like physical violence. Not because Susie still needed Grayson's approval, because she remembered exactly when that happened. The years she spent sacrificing herself to keep the marriage alive. Loving someone selfish often turns devotion into invisibility. Vanessa continued quietly. "He said you'd never leave because you were too emotionally dependent." Across the room, Grayson looked cornered for the first time in his life. Not powerful, not admired, pathetic. And somehow that broke something inside Susie emotionally, not in grief, in clarity, because suddenly she saw him exactly as he truly was. Not a powerful man, a deeply insecure one. Men secure in themselves don't destroy women to feel important. Carter finally stood slowly from the table. The room quieted instantly. He looked directly at his son with visible disappointment. "I spent years defending your ambition," he said heavily, "but this—" He glanced around the shattered room. "This is shameful!" Grayson looked stunned. "Dad," Carter's voice sharpened unexpectedly. "You humiliated your wife. You endangered the company. And apparently, your mother helped hide it." Diane looked outraged. "Don't you dare blame me!" But Carter ignored her completely. For the first time in years, the carefully controlled Hale family hierarchy was collapsing publicly, and nobody knew how to stop it. Grayson finally turned toward Susie fully, not angry now, desperate. "Suze, can we please talk privately?" The nickname sounded almost painful coming from him now, because once upon a time, hearing it felt like home. Now it felt manipulative. Still, Susie followed him quietly toward the empty library down the hallway, not because she owed him anything, because endings deserve honesty. The second the library doors closed behind them, Grayson exhaled sharply and ran both hands through his hair. This got out of control. Susie stared at him silently. Out of control. Interesting phrase for a man who cheated for years while financially preparing to abandon his wife. Grayson stepped closer. You blindsided me. No, Susie answered calmly. You just never believed I'd stop tolerating it. That shut him up instantly. The library felt painfully quiet now. Dark wood shelves, leather chairs, rain beginning softly outside the windows. A room built for powerful men making important decisions. And somehow Susie no longer felt intimidated inside spaces like this. Grayson's expression finally cracked completely. I know I messed up. Messed up. Not destroyed, not betrayed. Just messed up. The emotional immaturity almost exhausted her. You mocked me, Susie whispered. You made me feel weak for loving you. Grayson looked genuinely shaken now. I didn't mean you meant every word. Silence. Heavy, brutal silence. Then finally Grayson said the thing she once dreamed of hearing. You were the only real thing in my life. Years ago, that confession would have shattered her emotionally. Tonight it only made her sad. Because people often recognize genuine love only after they destroy it. Susie looked at him carefully one last time. At the panic, the regret, the fear of consequences finally arriving. And suddenly she understood something deeply important. Grayson didn't love her now because he suddenly valued her worth. He loved her now because he was losing access to it. That realization freed her completely. Tears filled Grayson's eyes for the first time. Please don't do this. Susie felt her own heartbreak stir faintly. Not enough to stay. Never enough again. Very softly she answered, You already did. Then she turned and walked out of the library without looking back, leaving Grayson Hale alone with the ruins of everything he spent years taking for granted. 3 months after the anniversary dinner collapsed, the Hale family publicly Susie Watkins woke up to silence. Real silence. Not the cold, suffocating kind that once haunted the mansion in Connecticut. Peaceful silence. Morning sunlight spilled across hardwood floors inside her new Manhattan apartment, while soft jazz played quietly from the kitchen speakers. The city stretched endlessly beyond floor-to-ceiling windows, silver and gold beneath early autumn light. For the first time in years, Susie woke up without anxiety sitting on her chest. No waiting for Grayson to come home late. No rehearsing conversations carefully to avoid conflict. No emotional calculations. Just peace. The feeling still surprised her sometimes. She wrapped a cream robe tighter around herself and carried coffee toward the window slowly. The apartment wasn't as large as the Hale mansion, but every inch of it belonged to her. That mattered more. The divorce became final 6 weeks earlier. Fast, quiet, efficient. Exactly the opposite of the marriage itself. Natalie Brooks ensured Susie protected herself financially before the corporate investigations surrounding Hale Capital intensified publicly. Several internal audits triggered investor panic almost immediately after the anniversary dinner. Then came the media coverage, then resignations, then lawsuits. Grayson's carefully constructed empire cracked faster than anyone expected. Because corruption survives only while people keep protecting it. And once fear entered the company, loyalty disappeared overnight. Susie never celebrated publicly. That surprised some people, especially Diane. During the final mediation meeting, Diane looked at Susie across the conference table with visible bitterness. I hope ruining us made you happy. Ruining us, Even then, Diane still refused accountability. Susie remembered sitting calmly beneath fluorescent office lights while lawyers shuffled paperwork around them. Then she answered quietly, "You spent years teaching me that survival mattered more than kindness." Diane said nothing after that. The strangest part, Susie no longer hated her. Hatred required emotional attachment, and Susie was finally free. Grayson, however, looked completely different now. Stress hollowed his face. Dark circles shadowed his eyes constantly. The confidence that once filled every room around him seemed fractured somehow, smaller. During the final divorce signing, he barely looked at anyone except Susie, like he still couldn't fully understand how the woman he underestimated became the person walking away strongest. "You really don't need me anymore," he said quietly afterward. The sadness in his voice almost sounded genuine. But Susie understood something now that she wished she learned years earlier. Being needed is not the same as being loved. And Grayson confused those things his entire life. Back in Manhattan, Susie sat at her dining table reviewing proposals for her consulting firm while sunlight warmed the apartment around her. Watkins Strategic Advisory officially launched 2 months ago, small at first, but growing quickly, because once women stop pouring all their intelligence into saving emotionally broken men, they often become unstoppable. Daniel Harper helped secure her first major contracts. Soon after, more clients followed. Word spread quickly through investment circles. Susan Watkins was brilliant, sharp, strategic, unshakably composed under pressure. Ironically, the same qualities Grayson once mocked now rebuilt her entire future. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Susie smiled immediately before opening the apartment door. Natalie stood there holding takeout bags and expensive pastries. "You look annoyingly peaceful," Natalie observed while walking inside. Susie laughed softly. "I think therapy's finally working." Natalie placed the bags onto the kitchen counter. "No, I think freedom is." That word settled warmly inside Susie's chest. Freedom. Not revenge. Not victory. Freedom. The ability to exist without constantly earning basic respect. The ability to wake up without emotional fear. The ability to belong to herself again. They spent the afternoon eating Thai food on the balcony overlooking Manhattan traffic, while autumn wind moved softly through the city below. At one point, Natalie glanced sideways at her. Any regrets? Susie thought about the question carefully. She thought about Chicago rooftops and young love, and all the years she genuinely believed loyalty could heal emotionally selfish people. Then she thought about the woman she became afterward. Stronger, calmer, more honest with herself. "No," she answered finally. Natalie smiled faintly. Good. That evening after Natalie left, Susie wandered slowly through the apartment, turning on lamps one by one. Warm light filled the rooms gently. Bookshelves, fresh flowers, soft music, no tension, no walking on emotional eggshells. The simplicity of peace almost made her emotional sometimes. Her phone buzzed suddenly against the kitchen counter. Unknown number. Susie frowned slightly before opening the message. It was Grayson. "Can we talk?" Just 4 words. Once upon a time, receiving a message from him would have controlled her entire emotional state for days. Now she simply stared at the screen thoughtfully. Not angry, not tempted either. Just done. The strange thing about healing is this. One day you realize the person who once devastated you no longer has access to your emotional center. And that realization feels like breathing fresh air after years underwater. Susie walked toward the window slowly, phone still in her hand. Far below, Manhattan glowed beneath evening lights. Beautiful. Alive. Endless. Her reflection stared back softly from the glass now. Not the exhausted wife from Connecticut. Not the woman begging for scraps of affection. Someone new. Someone rebuilt. Someone finally safe inside herself. Very calmly, Susie deleted the message unread, then set the phone down and walked away. No dramatic speech. No final confrontation. Because closure doesn't always arrive through revenge. Sometimes it arrives the moment you stop needing anything from the person who hurt you. Later that night, Susie sat curled beneath a blanket on the couch while rain tapped softly against the windows. She opened an old notebook from years earlier and found a sentence she once wrote during therapy. "I'm scared I wasted my life loving the wrong person." The words made her chest ache differently now. Not painfully, tenderly, because she understood something important at last. Love itself was never the mistake. Abandoning herself was. Susie closed the notebook gently and smiled faintly toward the rain-soaked city outside. For years, people told her survival depended on Grayson Hale, but the truth was much simpler than that. She was never weak, just loyal to people who mistook loyalty for permission to break her. And now she belonged only to herself. For the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a person can lose is not money, marriage, or status. It's themselves. Susie's story was never just about cheating, betrayal, or revenge. It was about what happens when someone spends so many years trying to be loved that they slowly disappear inside the process. So many people stay in toxic relationships not because they are weak, but because they are loyal. Because they keep hoping kindness will eventually soften cruelty. Because they believe sacrificing themselves proves love. But real love should never require you to abandon your dignity to keep it alive. One of the hardest lessons in life is realizing that some people only value your presence once they feel your absence. They mistake your patience for weakness, your forgiveness for permission, your silence for dependence. And sometimes the greatest act of self-respect is not screaming, fighting, or getting revenge loudly. Sometimes it's simply choosing yourself quietly. Walking away peacefully can be more powerful than destroying someone publicly. Healing can be more powerful than hatred. And rebuilding your identity after heartbreak is one of the bravest things a person can ever do. Because in the end, Susie didn't win because Grayson lost everything. She won because she finally stopped losing herself. If this story touched you in any way, let me know in the comments. Do you think Grayson truly loved Susie in the end? Or did he only realize her value once she stopped needing him? And if you've ever had to choose yourself after being hurt, betrayed, or underestimated, share your story below. Someone reading your words might need that strength today. Subscribe to the channel for more emotional drama stories about heartbreak, healing, self-worth, and powerful new beginnings.